Good morning and welcome to another edition of the Debrief podcast here on FingerLakes1.com. I'm Josh Durso, joined today by Jackie Augustine, my regular co-host. She's back. It's been about a month, but we're here. So village elections were yesterday. That's obviously one of the things we're going to be talking about. We have got a lot of other interesting little stories to touch on throughout today's episode. Really glad you're here with us, but let's talk about village elections. First and foremost, we found out this morning that longtime Waterloo Mayor Ted Young lost his bid for re-election. Republican Jack O'Connor defeated Young on Tuesday. Results are still unofficial, of course. O'Connor captured right around 100 votes more than Young did, which should be enough out of the 623 that were casted. I can't imagine that there are 90-something or more than 100 absentees right out in a village. And you actually have an interesting little village election story that you wanted to talk about too. And I think this sort of goes back to, and what I was sort of surprised about was, I'm not sure what I didn't have a chance to look and actually see what the population total or registered voter count is in the village of Waterloo. But
I know. It's 2,800.
2,800. Perfect. Glad you did know that.
I looked it up.
So there you have it. 2,800 and 623 ballots cast.
Right.
And that's this situation we're in. And in politics in general, especially at the local level, it's hard to get people out to vote. And I think there's a million different reasons why. But it's so hard to get people engaged to that level, especially when it's something that feels, I don't want to say inconsequential, but I feel like sometimes that's the way village elections are sort of viewed or looked at. There were several village races in Ontario and Seneca County that I'm aware of, and I believe a couple in Wayne County as well, that were just uncontested because you only had one person running. That's certainly not a unique situation.
Right. Well, I mean, perhaps worse than that. I mean, it's bad enough when a seat goes unopposed, but the more concerning thing, I think, is that in several small villages and even medium-sized villages, there were seats that went completely vacant, no candidates.
Hello.
And I mean, not even that, it's not even so much that these were just like small seats. Like, I brought up this story that I heard yesterday on the radio about the village of Poland, which you may not have heard of. It's between Syracuse and Utica. Had no one running for mayor. No one stepped forward to run for mayor. The woman who had been the mayor didn't want to run again, and nobody was interested. So by 34 write-in votes, a man, let me pull up his name, Lance Bennett, who had been the mayor a while ago and served a term and a half. He left during his second term for some health issues, was written in. And now it's up to him to decide. Well, actually, he gets the mayorship, right? Like, he is now the elected mayor. If he doesn't want it, he has to resign. You can't decline a write-in election. So if you win through write-in votes, you get it, right? Like,
for better or worse.
I guess if you're a real person who lives in the district, right? If SpongeBob won the election, he wouldn't be the mayor. But if you actually are a viable potential candidate and, meeting the qualifications, you just get the job, whether you want it or not. And it sounds like he will grudgingly accept it. The runner-up, if he were to resign, the town board would have to appoint someone. They might appoint his runner-up who received 12 votes. And this just, I don't want to keep talking. I have an opinion about this, but I want to hear what you have to say about these village elections in general.
I think there has to be. So when I'm sorting out and thinking about it, and I almost wrote a column about this a couple weeks ago, I was sort of on the fence about it. And I still might, but I'm not totally sure. I think most of the blame has to lie within the town and county party committees, I think.
guess.
And I know not in every community, especially with some of the smaller villages, you have people running on sort of their own unique party lines. But we know who's feeding them, the Republican and Democrat. Those are the parties that are finding what few viable candidates are willing to run now as it is.
Right.
I think really it's on them to identify and find candidates that people can get behind.
Yeah.
And I, honestly, like if you look at some of the races that are sort of playing out now in real time, for town supervisor in Seneca Falls, for district attorney in Seneca County, you have these scenarios where it doesn't always seem like the party, if you're going by what, when you have a very close decision on a committee, and the party then throws their interest behind X candidate
right
before the primary processes or before voters are allowed to have their say, it creates this really murky situation. I'm not sure, it's imperfect right now, and I think the best way that it could be addressed, or the way that we could find more viable candidates for all offices across the board, would be town and county committees doing more and doing better at finding people who are interested in running. I think too often you end up seeing party committees filled with folks who either hold a particular office or hold a particular interest in that jurisdiction or in that district, and that's kind of what drives their motivation to be on it. And I realize that's kind of a cynical way of looking at it, but at the same time, this is where your bench, so to speak, is connecting it to sports. This is where your bench is supposed to be created. These are the people who are supposed to be building that bench. So you do have a deep list of prospective candidates or people who are genuinely interested in serving for the right reasons. And I'm just not sure that the committees are doing their best or doing the best possible job for one reason or another in a lot of these smaller communities. And it hurts, especially when you see like a village election where, you have the possibility that someone could win an election with, less than 50 votes.
Right. And I mean, I agree with you that is the idea of a political party, right? Is to, although, the joke is, I'm part of no organized party because I'm a Democrat. But I think the idea of political parties is, like you said, to relate to people why this stuff matters and to get them involved and engaged and to then put people forward that they think will work for certain principles and ideas. In the city of Geneva, I think the parties do fill that role. I agree with you that elected officials shouldn't be members of their political the committee, because I think that does create an awkward situation, and I think it squeezes out other people that are just members of the community who maybe don't want to run for elected office but do want to stay informed on the issues and do have the connections to find people who want to run for elected office. So I frankly think I've always felt that putting elected officials on your local political committee is just filling seats and in a way that you shouldn't do. It takes a spot from somebody else. And in full disclosure, I'm not a member of the City Democratic Committee at all. But I do think that in Geneva, it works pretty well. But to fault the committee in these other towns is really to fault the voters, right? Because if you don't have a group of engaged people who want to keep a committee going and want to go out and find candidates, then this is what you end up with. I mean, my issue is...
But what about the scenario where, and I this might sound a little crass, but I don't think it's as uncommon as some people might want to believe. What about the scenario where those committee members are stonewalling people who don't quite fit what they believe is the right type of candidate from being involved with what they're doing?
Sure. I mean, that certainly happens. I feel, that definitely happens. And I do think that's an issue. But like you said, there is always the option for a candidate or a group of like-minded candidates to get together and field a different slate. I mean, that's last time, right? I ran on Geneva First. So I think that was the idea. But I have to wonder if you have a community that doesn't have anybody stepping forward to be the mayor, shouldn't you just be taken over by the next larger community? I mean, isn't this an argument for the redundancy and unnecessary parsing out of geographic interest that is New York State bureaucracy? Like, isn't this part of what's wrong with New York State, that we have to prop up so many local government structures that just baseline, to have a functioning local government, you have to expend a lot of money, both in state dollars and local property tax. If you don't even have people who want to run that government, shouldn't you just be part of a different community that has the capacity to run your small little area as part of their own? I suppose that's an unpopular view, but I really believe that New York State has too many jurisdictions, and that is part of our tax problem. But no one wants to talk about that because everybody likes their little piece of territory.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting situation. I'm not really sure. So I don't know that the swallow them up method is necessarily the best. But I do think that there should be consequences for sure. Maybe it comes down to some more of a nuanced fix where you start to lose certain controls that you as a village had. For example, if you can't elect, because I know a lot of these smaller villages and such have water and sewer commissioners and parks and rec commissioners. Right. You lose control of those things, meaning your budget still pays for the maintenance and the care of those things, but you lose control of your that sort of day-to-day operation.
Yeah. I mean, it would have to be taken over by the county. It would have to be that the county assumes those functions if they go vacant. Right.
And I think that's sort of, I think that's one of the other really tough sort of sticking points that a lot of people would have with it would be that, the county's already stretched. Right. The counties are already stretched. They don't have the means to take on the extra staff that it would be required to handle those types of operations. And the other thing is, I mean, for a village, if you're talking about sort of that enveloping that you're talking about, you mean that's just sort of like dissolving.
Sure.
So
I mean, this is the village of Poland, which exists within a town. I don't know if it's the town of Poland. I should have looked. I don't think so because I've never heard of the town of Poland, but I hadn't heard of the village of Poland either. So maybe that's the case. But, I think if we're crafting public policy here, Josh, I think that if there were a policy that said, if you fail to field a CEO of your community, right? A mayor, a board, a set of trustees, etc., then your entity ceases to be recognized as an independent jurisdiction. You become part of the county, you become part of your larger town, whatever. That would do one of two things. Either it would motivate people to get involved, right? If they care that much about their community and they think it needs to exist, well, then they would work for it. If they don't do that, then they are tacitly consenting to the dissolution of their community.
Well, I think, honestly, dissolution tends to be one of those items that gets a lot of attention and a lot of negative press when it's proposed. But at the end of the day, we've only seen one community, and that's Rushville, basically not opt to go for it. Right. And I think, honestly, that had more to do with the sort of complicated situation that Rushville's in, split between two counties. And that I think, with a community like that, I think it is a mess. That's difficult to pull off. Yeah. But to the other end, I don't think many folks would be opposed to dissolution in most cases because of the same sort of arguments that were made in Lyons, in Seneca Falls, and every other community that's voted to ultimately dissolve in New York State, which is taxes will be lower. Right. And even if it's temporary, like we're seeing in Seneca Falls, that the tax savings weren't necessarily forever, and we're kind of working our way back up to that spot. at the end of the day, it comes down to people want to save money, and New York State is a very expensive place to live. It's a very expensive place to do business, and any way that they can save money or have a more unified effort when it comes to, and I think
that I find to be the more compelling argument, that a more unified approach. I mean, it's like City of Geneva, Town of Geneva. Like we should be pulling in the same direction. Why are those two separate jurisdictions?
Well, it's interesting because just yesterday, I sat down with some folks from Yates County to talk about the DRI effort and that type of thing. And it was fascinating to me that the entire county is behind Penn Yan. And yes, I realize that's because there's a lot of money flowing in right now because of the DRI, and they've got their 15 projects identified. But the flip side of that is also, that takes effort. That does not just sort of happen overnight. Like that kind of, it takes really a campaign to get an entire county on the same page behind one single smaller community, especially when that, you're talking about, I believe it's north of 50% of all employment in Yates County is in Penn Yan.
I did not know that.
And I mean, that's one of those, it's just, I think it's incredible to see, especially when you talk about, compare that to an Ontario County or a Seneca County where you have either that west-east divide or that north-south divide where folks feel there's a pretty big disparity between the two. Now, when it comes to those state initiatives that we're talking about, like the DRI, I think a town is much, much better equipped to go through the process of something like the DRI and win as opposed to a village. Now, Penn Yan is sort of unique because Yates County was really the one, Yates County, Finger Lakes Economic Development, that was basically their chamber was the one running the show. So that, to me, is a bit of a unique situation down there. I think, generally speaking, your cities and towns are the best off to win those dollars. And actually, we've talked about it here before, some of the villages in the Finger Lakes, especially in upstate New York, across the board, they're the ones who need money most for things like infrastructure improvement, to improve walkability, to improve sort of that connectivity, to draw more people in.
Right.
That's sort of I guess that's where the line is. And in that scenario, I think most people would probably be on board with what you're talking about.
Well, let's hope so, because I think it's sensible.
Now, well, and that said, it's something that I don't think there would be sensible, but would there be any political will to make it happen?
Well,
ever?
I don't know. And I don't know if this transitions us into another topic or not. If it does, great. But look at what's going on with the landfills. It's such a different, in my view, it's such a different dynamic in Seneca County versus Ontario County. And I think that has something to do, largely to do, I guess, with the fact that Seneca Meadows is privately owned and Casella is operating the county landfill, right? But I really feel like the city and town of Geneva have been unified in understanding that, we are neglected by the western end of the county. Those supervisors, they don't really care. They don't believe us. They don't think what we say is legitimate. We are like the just discarded area of the county. But also, I think the town and city of Geneva are seeing that we're really far ahead of the curve in terms of dealing with waste and sustainability issues. And so we have a role to play in leading the county in that direction. So the political issues seem, I don't know. I can't figure out really the difference between the town and the city of Geneva in terms of political will and political interest. So once again, I still maintain that, we should just gobble up the town as part of the city of Geneva. And, that's its own legislative district. Supervisor Venuti stays where he is. And, then we have more collective impact than we might otherwise by operating as two independent jurisdictions. And we can pull resources, state resources, county resources, local property tax resources into that joint vision of Geneva. But
now that would be a spot where I would differ on that.
Okay.
I think you can roll a village into a town. I don't think you can roll successfully a town into a city. A city has a very specific, because the demographics of the city are, and the needs, frankly, of the city are vastly different than that of the town.
I disagree. And I think that there are, although it's not done in New York State, successful states in the country, which have far lower property tax than we do, allow this kind of municipal stretch whereby if a city has the capacity and ability to provide water, police, fire, sewer, they can just annex the town. They can just take that land over. I'm not saying it needs to be hostile. I'm just saying I think it would make sense that we consolidate. I don't think the town and city demographics are necessarily all that different. I see the town as kind of a neighborhood of the city.
Ooh.
I'm sure the people in the town wouldn't agree with me.
Oh my gosh.
But they should, because I think it's right.
I think in that scenario, and this isn't to put like the city of Geneva on an island by itself, but there are issues within the city with policing and things like that that just aren't issues elsewhere. And I don't agree. Here's my concern. If you, and I'm not sure who would agree or disagree with this, but I think if that scenario played out, I think you might have one side and the other saying, well, wait a second, you're not paying as much attention to this issue as you were before.
I don't see that as being any different than just general neighborhood dynamics. I mean, I do think that I don't think there is anything. Okay, this goes directly against the city's motto that it is uniquely urban. Because I was about to say I don't see anything so unique about the city that is different from the town, but I guess if you look at what is the function of a city at its most basic level, right? It provides a hub of activity. It has a centralized downtown business district. It has the amenities. It hosts, frankly, the nonprofits, the hospitals, the schools, the colleges, the churches, the places, the social and cultural amenities that draw people to a region. The town is not going to have its own downtown. Or shouldn't. I mean, that would be unnecessarily duplicative, right? The town has a slightly different character. It's the more rural neighborhood that you might find in a large city that has different neighborhoods.
Okay, so here's the slippery slope.
Okay.
I'm going to use Newark, and because you mentioned hospitals.
Okay.
Newark and Penn Yan both have a hospital.
Yes.
Both are sort of like the hubs of the surrounding areas. Should the towns that surround them thereby, which probably have better voter turnout, because that's kind of where we started here, then the villages themselves be rolled into the village, because the village is what actually has use Penn Yan as an example, has the water and sewer service, has the hospital, has the amenities that you're describing in the way that the city has. I think it is more reasonable at that point to say the town of Geneva, if you're going to talk about consolidation, I think they would be better served rolling into Phelps, or rolling into whatever town would be most sensible to connect to. Would that be the town of Seneca, I guess?
I just disagree, because if you look, let me say another thing that I think is different. I mean, like with Penn Yan, look at Keuka is at Keuka Park, right? So, I mean, that that should be Penn Yan, right? Mm-hmm. But if you look at the city of Geneva, geographically, right, it is like this. Well, it's not really a donut, because it doesn't go, the lake's on the other side. It is like the croissant of, I don't know, pick your breakfast food, right? Yeah. It is kind of nestled, it is I don't know where this is going. Anyway, the city is surrounded geographically by the town. Yeah. And as you pass from one area to the next, I don't think there is such a stark difference that you would say, oh, yes, I've traveled somewhere. If I want to get to Phelps, I do travel through some farmland, and I'm the roads are different, the sidewalk ends, right? Like in the Shel Silverstein sense. But it's not that abrupt when you go from city to town. I mean, look at Slauson Lane, White Springs Road, one side's city, one side's town. Looking at them, you wouldn't know any different. So, yeah, maybe not all the town, maybe just some parts of it. Maybe we just need to grab some parts of it, like the 5 and 20 corridor. That seems like an urban type environment, a city, I guess it's suburban, but a city type environment. I don't know why that's a different jurisdiction.
I think the issue is, and this is, we sort of saw this play out after dissolution happened in Seneca Falls. Folks who lived in the village, once their taxes started to increase again, felt they did not have the unique representation that they once had when it was its own sort of private entity, we'll say. I think the exact same thing happens in a city if you go down that road where you pull the town in, and God forbid the town, you know, politics is all about sort of the series of events, right?
Right.
And these sort of little things. If you have 4 or 5 consecutive wins for the town, and the city suddenly feels like it's on the outside looking in, and they aren't the focus anymore, they're going to feel like their politics, their elected officials aren't working for them. And that's where I think maybe that's where you and I sort of differ on this issue, where it's like, I'm fine with having consequences for these communities that struggle to turn people out to vote. But I'm also not fine with sort of this mass consolidation of different offices in different jurisdictions just because no one turned out to vote. Like if we have a culture problem where people don't want to vote or people aren't voting, the solution to that isn't giving more power to the next biggest thing, because eventually the biggest thing is Albany, and Albany will rule once you get there. There's no coming back.
Well, that's a fair point, but I do believe that if you can't even put forward a mayoral candidate, like if your community has no one who wants to lead it, then what is your identity? What is the point of being a separate entity? But yeah.
So we touched on it for a minute, I should say. Let's talk about the landfill. Ontario County found out that leachate may be at some point getting transported to Ohio.
On trains.
By train.
Trains.
Taking the train.
Liquid.
Taking the train right out of state.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like this is using Seneca Falls, Seneca County, Waterloo as sort of the backdrop. This is fuel for that not in my backyard fire. Those people who are going to say, well, wait a second, you're fine with that being trucked to Ohio, but not keeping it in Ontario County or letting it stay in Ontario County? Please explain. And that, I think that's going to fuel that argument, or those folks who are making that argument.
Right.
So that's why when I read this headline and I saw the story and I started reading through it, I was thinking to myself, ooh, I guess maybe this addresses a couple of the issues that people had with the leachate or with the landfill.
I don't think it does.
None at all?
No, I think this is another example of playing into Casella's bottom line, right? I mean, they should be required to make the appropriate upgrades to pre-treat their leachate on site so that it could be accepted by an Ontario County water treatment facility. I'm not saying anyone wants leachate, right? No one wants it. But the fact of the matter is, the more that we allow Casella to offload the negative impacts and save money by doing so, I know they're going to say, well, rail, this is actually expensive. No. Look at their 2017 annual reports online. You can see what their strategies are, why they're doing it. They aren't doing anything out of the benevolent kindness of their hearts. This is all a financial decision. So if First Geneva didn't want to take it anymore, right, because it was too bad for our plant, now it looks like Canandaigua. I don't really know why Canandaigua is not taking it anymore, but I have to assume it's similar reason. So what does Casella do? Well, the county owns this facility. The county needs to step up and say, as part of your contract, You need to keep things local. You shouldn't be taking in as much outside trash, but that trains out of the whatever. But you also aren't going to be able to move your waste, your byproduct of waste, through trains somewhere else to make it cost effective for you to keep running the way you're already running. At some point, someone's got to put the pressure on Casella and say, your same way of doing things isn't going to work anymore. And just trucking the leachate somewhere else, trucking it beyond Ontario County, putting it on a train, taking it out of state, it is still the same messed up system, which is generating odors, it's generating debris, pollution.
It's a mess.
It is not forcing them to do better. It's just forcing them to do something different. Different doesn't help us. Better is the only thing that helps us. So I find it actually quite frustrating. And if anybody thinks that getting train traffic involved is not a precursor to the trains running the other way as well, I think people are fooling themselves. As soon as you start saying, let's get the infrastructure going so that stuff can go from our landfill on a train out, how is stuff not going to come then from other parts of the country by train back in? That is going to be the way that this makes sense financially going forward. And I don't understand. People have seen the upgrades that have been made along the line through Shortsville. This has been in the works for a while, and we are being sold a bill of goods that somehow this is about helping the community. It is not.
Yeah, and to me it just seems like a really bad temporary Band-Aid to a situation. And maybe that's intentional because they don't know what their future is, or the future doesn't look very bright from corporate Casella's mindset.
I don't know. If you read their stuff, I think their future is pretty bright.
So you don't think that, I mean, it seems more concrete to me anyway, and this is sort of interesting, I guess. You have a local law in Seneca Falls that, in theory, mandates the closure of Seneca Meadows by a certain date.
Right.
But the flip side of that is it seems that Ontario County has their ducks more firmly in a row to get the landfill closed in 10 years, or they're,
Yeah, I mean, let's hope
eventually.
So. But, right.
And if that's the case, I don't, it just doesn't really make sense. This action, this specific action to me just doesn't really make sense because what do you gain? Like, what do you gain from taking something that's created or been delivered in some way, shape, or form to one place from another place and take it to another third place? It just, to me, it just complicates the whole thing. And honestly, I think the Board of Supervisors in Ontario County and everyone involved, any person who feels like they're a stakeholder, just needs to do a little more.
Yeah.
The landfill opposition, pretty strong in Seneca County. You don't hear about it nearly as much now as you did when Local Law 3 was sort of being debated and Local Law 2 tried to roll it back. But really, we're still talking about, a community that's pretty hard set aligned against this thing.
Yes.
Or so it would seem. And Ontario County has so much more control of their own destiny in their situation.
Well, they do, and that's what's so frustrating.
Right, like that's the part that doesn't make any sense. They are
acting in many ways as though their hands are just as tied as Seneca County is. Not to let Seneca County off the hook. But really, if it's... I'm going to say something that's going to make a lot of people angry, so brace yourself. No surprise, but okay. Casella's executives are good at what they do. They are intelligent and they are savvy. Our Ontario County supervisors, let me say this carefully, may not always be up to the challenge in terms of discussing, understanding, foreshadowing, following the train of logic about solid waste management, as the Casella executives are. So sometimes you see very clearly what happens. Casella comes in, it's got a very flashy song and dance, here's what's going to happen, and the eyes of the supervisors kind of glaze over. Not our Geneva supervisors, for the most part, are on to what's going on, okay? Canandaigua maybe is starting to wake up a little bit. But the other supervisors are like, they are taken in. They are taken in by the show. And how many of our county supervisors have read Casella's financial report to its shareholders? How many of them know where Casella's going? How many of them know the difference between Casella's Eastern market and Casella's Western market and how they're trying to expand and deal with both? They don't. They are not, the county is not even trying to outsmart its adversary, because they still think they're just in it together and Casella's trying to do what's best for all of us.
Hey, listen, if you're accepting money, if you're taking that check, you are to some degree, it's a bad word, I know, partner, community partner. That's that word that's always thrown around when we start talking about landfills and stuff.
Right.
If you're taking the check, one way or another, you're a partner. You can't escape that. I'm not saying that means that any entity is a good or bad partner. I'm just saying, partner, if you're accepting a monetary, I don't want to say gift, but if you're taking money in exchange for a service or something to that effect, whether it's a host agreement or whether it's, an actual contract.
Yeah.
It's all the same.
Yep.
And
the frustrating part is, if you own the thing that they're managing and you still feel like they're giving you a gift, that is such an inversion of power. You don't even understand that you're actually the one who sets the terms. They don't set the terms and then you just rubber stamp them. Mm-hmm. You have to take the reins. You have to know their business better than they know their business. And let me tell you, from observing the discussions with the Ontario County Board of Supervisors, they don't know Casella's business even half as much as they should. And it's irresponsible. It is irresponsible to be in charge of something that large and to have such little amount of understanding.
So let's talk about another environmental story that popped up.
Yes, this is
Peter Mantius. His reporting is literally second to none.
He's so good.
So we learned this week that the former manager of the Cayuga Regional Digester, which was designed to generate electric power from reprocessed farm manure and food waste, quit in January because he felt he was being strong-armed into processing truckloads of illicit types of waste, municipal solid waste in particular. Mm-hmm. Up until the final week of Roser's tenure, the digester processed manure from local farms and source-separated organics, that's food waste, and from hospitals and cafeterias, places like that. Then, in early January, it began accepting truckloads of household waste and other items not allowed under its permit from the State Department of Environmental Conservation.
And who was bringing that in? Oh, Casella. Right. Okay.
So this, to me, is the stuff of nightmare for anybody who thinks that, who might be skeptical of what these landfill operations and these sort of waste collection operations, one way or another, are doing, because the DEC didn't know about this. And the only reason the DEC found out and ultimately had to launch an investigation was because of a small group of really concerned citizens led by Jessica Marks.
It always is a small group of very concerned citizens.
But this is that scenario where, and it hasn't been talked about much recently, but this lends itself to that idea that the way the DEC is handling these types of operations isn't working.
Yeah.
Like, they're either short-staffed or they're short-sighted and they're not paying attention to what's happening in front of them. Surprise inspections, judging from the way this incident was handled and sort of how a surprise inspection took place, it sounds like about a week or a week and a half ago.
Right.
Doesn't sound like it happens very often.
Right.
And of course, if you're running one of these facilities, or if you're running any kind of facility, you can take, nursing home in Wayne County as an example that's received a whole lot of flack for having 90-some violations in the last year, but they're still up and running. If you're given notice every time an inspection is coming, you're going to take care of the egregious stuff so that you're at least passing. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And if it's not a surprise, or if it's not at least somewhat unplanned, maybe they give you like a 2-week window or something like that, and they don't tell you exactly when they're coming in. You're not really getting a good assessment of how they're acting when you're not there. Right?
Yeah, I mean, this makes me think, maybe this is a bad analogy, but it works for me. If I get on to the school announcements and I say, attention everyone, at 1:47 p.m., we will be having a fire drill. Am I actually testing the ability for people to respond to a fire drill? Or am I just going through the motions of filling out to the Department of Education that I had a fire drill, but I wanted it to be as least disruptive to the student operations as possible? So is the DEC in the business of actually enforcing and regulating the statutes and regulations that they have about operating these? Or is it in the business of trying to facilitate continued operations of the waste haulers, landfills, waste operators, anaerobic digesters, all of the things we're talking about here, that are part of its overall waste stream management plan for the state, right? I mean, isn't this the same question we're seeing right now with the FAA and these Boeing planes? Like, isn't it the case that when you have the industry participating in its own monitoring, being part of the agency doing the oversight, that sometimes there ends up being this trade-off of, do we enforce or do we enable? And I think you're right. Letting people know, hey, we're coming down to do an inspection, is not a serious way of actually determining whether or not someone's complying.
Yeah, it doesn't work. And I think there's plenty of evidence at this point to sort of showcase that point.
Right. Yeah, why not put the landfills in charge of their own odor complaints?
But I don't think that you can have a conversation about this issue in Cuba County and not have a simultaneous discussion about Seneca Meadows and Seneca County, High Acres, and then also the Ontario County landfill.
Right.
And I think that's kind of going to be the theme of the conversation this coming Monday. Myself and Peter are going to be on Evan Dawson's Connections, NPR, WXXI in Rochester,
right.
The 1 o'clock hour. But it's a regional issue. And while this is a very hyper local, and this is I think the most eye-opening part of this particular story is how brazen it is. Mm-hmm. It's almost as if the folks behind the digester were like,
they knew this is where they were going from the beginning.
We don't care that you're going to walk away and you might talk.
Right.
Like, we just don't care.
Right.
And on the regulatory side, I would be genuinely worried about that.
Yeah.
What the message that they're by sending. I know. That they just don't care.
I have to say, in full disclosure, I'm involved with a group that is trying to do food waste diversion in the city of Geneva, and that will go into these vermiculture worm trenches that the city's in the process of building. And here's the thing. Organic waste needs to get out of the landfills, right? It's over 18% of what's being dumped. It shouldn't be in there. It increases the odor. It's not the only thing increasing the odor, clearly. I mean, using wastewater or sewer sludge as top cover for your garbage is certainly going to smell bad. But the thing is, organic waste diversion from the waste stream is important. And when stuff like this happens, it's really a setback for that effort, because people start to say, it's like when we found out that some places were dumping the recycling people put out into the trash, right? Then people say, well, why bother recycling? Mm-hmm. If people see stories like this, not that I mean, the story is important and we need to talk about it, but what the DEC has a vested interest in cracking down on stuff like this so that people don't start saying, well, why bother separating food waste? They're just going to do something that's even worse with it, you know? So I don't think the DEC understands it's not just about getting compliance. It's about building public trust and actually having a sensible strategy that people have confidence in and will participate in that solves the problem. Nobody is looking at solving the problem. It's all these stopgap measures of trying to catch up with what the private sector is doing. And it's, I don't know, Peter's report is so good. And it raises so many questions, especially since Casella has this We Care Waste and Recycling operation with the same address. Like, this is a bigger story. I mean, he's just starting to get into this. And I think these waste haulers and landfill operators better know that a small group of concerned citizens are on the trail.
Right. So, obviously, we've spent a lot of time now talking about sort of the environmental, the voter implication, all the different things, sort of those two issues, those two big issues, voter turnout, how engaged folks are in communities, and then this environmental pushback across the region. Those are two pretty connected issues. But I want to break off of that a little bit. So Canandaigua, the city of Canandaigua this week continued a discussion about banning single-use plastics. Straws, plastic bags, and plastic utensils are all on the chopping block for the city as it tries to reduce their landfill footprint. Pactiv, one of the world's largest food packaging manufacturers and one of Ontario County's largest employers, voiced its concern. Terry Lafferty, the company's plant manager in Ontario County, says the ban wouldn't impact sales since their product doesn't hit local shelves directly, but his concerns about branding and ability to attract employees for the plant should the city pass legislation like this. And obviously the backdrop to this story is that the state kind of wants to go this route anyway, or is trying to. Your reaction to that, because I think when it was either when you and I talked about it or when Ted Baker and I talked about it on this podcast, it was, well, don't stop at plastic bags. If you're going to do this, like, do it. Like, do everything, because plastic bags, the utensils, I also think about like styrofoam, all the styrofoam stuff. And is styrofoam somehow like excluded from this? Because if styrofoam's excluded, then dear God, we have bigger problems than plastic bags, because styrofoam has to go first, I think. All of that happening is, should the city go this route, or should the city sort of stay back and see what the state does first before they make their decision?
I think the city's on the right track, but I don't understand Pactiv's statement, because Pactiv also makes compostables. So why couldn't Pactiv, if they're worried about branding and marketing and image, why doesn't Pactiv step forward and say, hey, city, if you want to do this, a great thing we could do is partner to have some rollout, some initial, gift to local businesses of compostable serviceware, which then they can start sourcing from Pactiv, and that would actually raise their corporate image. I don't understand how. It just doesn't seem like there's enough creative thinking going along with this.
Do they have multiple plants? Is this one of those large corporations that has like multiple plants, like across a large territory?
They do, but I know. Well, okay. I have been to the Pactiv plant and seen their compostables in storage. Like I've seen them there. You can get them there.
Right.
I don't know if they make them there, but they have them. And I just, regardless of where they're made, though, it does seem like they would be able to use this as an opportunity to showcase that they have a compostable line and take the edge off a little bit for the local businesses that are going to have to switch over. Mm-hmm. That, to me, sounds like a win for everybody. What's that triple bottom line? Is that what that is called?
I think you'd be right if it were not a corporation. I think you would see if it were a privately held company that didn't have multiple locations or didn't have this scenario. Because what I'm guessing is probably primarily what they're producing at that facility is not compostables.
Probably.
They're probably producing mostly plastic. And this is just my thought process. I think the corporation is going to say, we'll close that location and we'll consolidate that operation elsewhere before they actually look at, oh, yeah, we'll use this as a pilot and better the community. But I just don't think that that mindset is there. And I don't think that's the first thought that any corporation has.
But I think I think they're making a mistake in their logic then, because if what they're saying is we don't actually supply locally, but we're worried that we won't be able to recruit workers because of our image for making plastic, well, then you could change your image, focus on the fact that maybe not in Canandaigua, but as a corporation, you do make compostables. And I don't think someone's going to say, oh, well, then I'd like to work there, but not on this particular line. I think people are able to say, okay, well, this corporation is engaged in all of these things, and it's still a job. Like, I think that they can't have it both ways, right? If they think that the image of the corporation is going to be hurt because of something that actually isn't sourced locally, then flipping the script on what Pactiv is about should enhance their image, even though that's also not produced or sourced locally. So, I don't know. I'm just not buying the outrage from their perspective.
Yeah, and to be fair, I don't think it was, judging from some of the video that I saw, I didn't see the full statement, but it didn't really seem like outrage. It was more just sort of, hey, this is probably the point of view that our company is going to take on this. I don't think it really matters because I do think the state is going to push forward with the plastic bag ban. And then I think it's just maybe a year, 2 years max, and I think we're totally anti-plastic stuff in New York State, honestly, just because it moves so quickly. So let's talk quickly. We'll sort of wrap the show up with this one. I've been really interested to get your take on the college admissions scandal that has been it's been all over the place the last week. I'm really curious about your take because I've had different thoughts about it, but I feel like I'm coming from a more cynical place where I'm more apt to say, oh, whatever, that's their problem, and less, well, you go first, and then I'll come in and see if there's any overlap.
Well, I think I would defer to my column. I wrote a column about it that was in yesterday, and it just basically said that this is just another example of wealth hoarding, where people who want to get ahead at any cost will just gobble up resources and keep them for themselves, whether they're entitled to them or not. And that if they want to do it that way, that we should start a wealth scholars program, scholars with a $, and that could be on your diploma, right? You pay twice the tuition, you get to go to whatever school you want, and when you graduate, not only do you have your diploma, assuming you graduate, you have your diploma from this fancy school, but it also says wealth scholars, so it's reinforcing that you're so wealthy. And some people will understand what that means, and other people will just happily go along to the bright, financially set futures that they already would have had if they hadn't gone to college at all.
Yeah, and that's I think that's partly where I wind up landing on it is after you have one or two jobs, after you graduate from college, assuming you graduated and you didn't do anything too crazy while you were at college, right. Most employers, most people don't even ask where you went to college. I mean, it isn't part of the, and when you start to talk about when you introduce the money into the situation, and I think maybe if I have an issue with it, it's this. There's a legal way to do what they wanted to do what these people were doing, and it happens all the time.
Yep.
I referenced in a draft of a column that I was thinking about writing, I had referenced a conversation that happened on Evan Dawson's program in December. And he recently brought that re-aired part of that this past week, where essentially he had folks from RIT and the U of R, and they both said donors have an advantage.
Yep.
Period.
Name a building.
Legacy donor, whatever sort of attachment you want to connect to that student who is going through the process, they have an advantage. So I personally, I don't like the prosecution of the people who did it this way, while there is a legal and equally shady way to do it without any consequences.
Yeah.
Right? Like, to me, it's the ethical sort of like balance. Which are you like? So you're saying this is okay. So if you donate, $2 million and contribute to a building, that's one thing. But if you pay this firm that's going to like basically create a resume for your student so they get in, say the same amount of money or maybe slightly less, that's a crime?
Yep. Nope. I'm with you. And I'm less interested in the legal part altogether. I think, there should be a system of shame for this. And that's why I think this Wealth Scholars thing would be great. If your parents donated a building 3 years ago because they wanted you to go there, you're a wealth scholar. If your parents paid somebody to take your SATs for you, and then also paid the school so that the coach would say you're a member of a team that for a sport you've never played, you're a wealth scholar. And let's just call people what they are. We have no problem labeling people who are living in poverty. Well, why is it so hard for us to get outraged and to want to attach a label to people gaming the system with serious, huge consequences? We go always after the little guy. We never say anything about the big fish. And I don't understand that.
Well, and the thing that sort of annoyed me about the coverage of it was there were a lot of talk afterwards, especially on some of the radio shows that I was listening to. Well, think about all the valedictorians that don't get into these elite schools, or they get denied by one or two schools, and they're potentially taking a spot away from those. No, they're not. They're not taking a spot away from those students. The students that are ultimately getting, it's not an apples to apples comparison, right? Like, the student who gets bumped out is likely the one at the bottom of the list, the one who just barely got in. And to me, the implication of that, especially, and I'm much more worried about that happening, this type of scenario happening at small liberal arts institutions than I am bigger ones, because you think about some of your smaller colleges. Think of I think back to when I was in high school. I was your average run-of-the-mill, middle-of-the-pack student in every single sense. I finished in the middle of my class. My GPA was around 84, 85 range. I was denied by most of the four-year schools that I applied to because I just barely fell under the line. And for a student that would have needed extra help or would have benefited from going to a small school with small class sizes and that more one-on-one attention, they would be forced to then go to another school where they probably aren't going to get that same attention. Right. And the situation that's created is the students who need the most assistance or need the most help are on the outside looking in. Right. And it's like, what? Like, those are the people who are affected by that kind of gaming of the system, whether it's the kind that's being prosecuted right now or whether it's somebody who just happened to be the kid of someone who donated a sizable amount of money for something, a room or a building or something like that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And that's why I say just make it a market, right? I mean, not that I don't agree with this. I'm saying within the existing system, assuming that is not going to change, then make these kids pay double, triple tuition and let in a couple of kids who actually should be there.
Yeah, and the other part of it is, the bigger question I feel like at this point is, what's the value of a college degree? Like, I think that's one of the bigger, broader questions that this situation is going to sort of, because a lot of the reaction has been, well, good, let those fools go or pay a ridiculous amount of money to go to these elite schools. I'm going to go to the local liberal arts school or community college, and I'm going to walk away with something that is good for me, and I'm going to have a damn good life. Right. And I don't care. And I think that's really interesting, because it seems like there is, especially with these larger institutions, there is more there's this built-in idea that there's something valuable about going there, where I think a lot of the smaller schools can make just as much or maybe more of a case for their degree being more valuable.
It depends. I mean, my opinion would be that if you are like a serious student, then it doesn't matter as much, right? Because you are going to be separated from whatever class you're in by the attachment you have with your professors, the work product you put out, the internships you do, that kind of stuff. But here's the problem. It's the middle and bottom of the pack rich kids who get the benefit of having that degree, right? You do basically nothing. You have a 1.9 from USC. You're going to get a job over the kid who has a 3.9 from a smaller school. That might happen. They wouldn't fight so much about it if it didn't have value. And in certain circles, it does. And that's the problem. That's what I talk about with the wealth hoarding. There is a culture that they're swimming in that this stuff does make a difference.
It makes a difference. Okay. So see, and maybe this is partly where the whole like digital modern world that we live in now, I don't think, maybe if you go back 20 or 30 years, there's more of a separation between those two pools that you're talking about.
Right.
I think that with social media, with sort of the digital tools that exist, the remote availability to equalize the playing field,
right.
I don't think there's as much of a separation anymore. And you know what? Maybe this is one of the areas where I'm not as sympathetic to the whole issue. When it comes right down to it, I think your ability to market yourself is more important than the degree you hold. And at the end of the day, people make decisions based on how well you market yourself, especially when it comes to employment. I know we like to think that it all comes down to how qualified but if you are a person, think about all the elected officials and the public servants that we've talked about on this program over the last 2 years. Think about the people who have presented themselves as highly qualified, highly equipped individuals to do certain jobs or to fill functions.
Right.
And they've turned out to be complete nightmares.
Yeah.
That is like, to not acknowledge that that's part of the problem. I mean, I think that's part of the problem in terms of how we evaluate people. But at the same time, for those people who might be, some of them might be on the outside looking in, the playing field can be leveled just by pushing as hard as you were, 10 minutes before you found out that you didn't get into that Ivy League school or that school that you really wanted to.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to be naive and optimistic. And I know I've been told many times that I buy into this myth of merit, that hard work and focus and achievement in an honest way will yield better outcomes than swindling. And you're right. There are many examples where that is not the truth. The swindlers win. But in a moral sense, they are losers.
Well, no, here's the thing.
So I'm not giving up my commitment that...
Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's a this or that situation.
Right.
I just don't think if there's any critique that could be made pretty easily of most college universities across the country is that they aren't really preparing students the best for what the modern work life is all about.
Well, I think that's because they have moved away in large part from fundamental critical thinking. We are churning out people who are focused on practicing a particular slice of something, right? A particular occupation. And we are not training citizens. And that's part of the reason why we're getting such bad elected officials in some cases, because people are falling for anything, because our focus on critical thinking has declined. Full disclosure, I teach philosophy, right? I teach ethics. People say, what does that do for me?
Thinking.
In my opinion, that's critical. Right? If you can't reason, how do you navigate the world?
Well, it's like you go through, I have a couple friends who went to school for marketing, just this very basic, and marketing, and actually also a couple people, HR. At the very end of their degree programs, the very last semester, they had to take a couple classes. They were both either 1 or 2 credit hour classes, and they were all geared toward, this is how you interview. This is how you market yourself. This is how you, think about this. You spend, if the full pie is 100%, you're spending 98% of your academic 4-year life educating on this topic, and then only 2% actually learning how to market yourself and market those skills that you've developed over that 4-year period in the real world.
Right.
And that to me is where that's where the gap is. And if you're one of those people who's left on the outside in a situation like this, or feels like they've been, nixed by the system for one reason or another, that is where you take advantage. You market yourself. You figure out exactly where your skills are and where the people who went through that process, where they lack, and you that's where you beat them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Assuming all other things are equal, knowledge-based, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a very interesting, complex situation. And, you talk about when this story first broke, you had people talking about, oh my God, years in jail. I highly doubt that anybody's going to prison over this, except for maybe the guy who was actually behind the company that was working through all of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But that'll be, usually rich people don't go to jail.
Yeah.
So even for things that anyone of lesser means would spend a lot of time in jail for. But there's another story.
Yeah, so last sort of question for you is, village elections obviously behind us now. Is there anything that you're watching over the next 2 to 3 to 4 weeks of interest? Obviously, in about a week and a half, 2 weeks, we've got petition filing between April 1st and April 4th. That'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Anything else in particular that you're watching?
No, I guess, I am curious to see how this waste management stuff is going to continue. And I mean waste management in the general sense, not the company, although them too. But yeah, I would encourage any candidate filing their petitions not to file on April 1st. That's just my little point of advice, just life advice. Don't file your candidacy on April 1st. But I am eager to see who ends up running, because I have to say, like in Geneva, I have no idea. Like I'm surprised by some of what I've heard so far, and I think I will continue to be surprised once the actual filings are done.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that's it for today. We'll be back in a couple weeks. I'll be back with Jackie in a couple weeks. I will be back next week with another episode. Until then, find us online. All the links to all the stories we talked about, of course, will be in the YouTube description, and then also in the story on fingerlakes1.com. See you next week, guys.